Hercule Poirot exposes the Gossamer veil. Swindlers, Chapter 1. The inciting incident. The great chandelier in the Palmerton Hall ballroom refracted the evening's laughter into 1,000 crystal shards. Under its opulent gaze, the guests moved in elegant currents, their silks and satins rippling like the surface of a secretive lake. It was Lady Anstruthers' annual masquerade, an event whispered about months in advance, where the city's most influential figures shed their reputations for a few enchanted hours. Among the crowd glided the enigmatic Mrs. Violet March, her mask a delicate filigree of silver threads, shimmering beneath the candlelight. Violet, the talk of 3 continents, was known for her wit, her scandalous lineage, and the rumored fortune that accompanied her. Tonight, she radiated a brittle allure. Her laughter just a shade too bright, as if daring the world to spot the fracture. It was nearing midnight when the trouble began. The band's waltz faded, replaced by an electric hush. A tremulous footman, pale beneath his powdered wig, approached Lady Anstruther at the dais. The message he whispered seemed to tighten every line on her aristocratic face. With a composure born of generations of command, she stood and tapped a spoon against her crystal glass. "My dear friends," she announced, her voice slicing through the hush, "I regret to inform you that Lady Henrietta Perrot has suffered a most unfortunate collapse. I beg you all to remain calm." Instantly, the spell was broken. The ballroom's corners filled with anxious murmurings and sidelong glances. 2 guests hurried to the antechamber where Lady Henrietta, always resplendent in peacock blue, now lay motionless upon a settee. Dr. Llewellyn, the family physician, was already at her side, his brow knitted in concern. Within moments, the news had slithered through every alcove and corridor. Lady Henrietta was dead. Her fan, still clenched in one gloved hand, was crushed beyond recognition. No sign of injury, no witness to violence, just a sudden end amid laughter and champagne. The constables, summoned with speed and discretion, found little to allay suspicion. Lady Henrietta's pearl necklace, a priceless heirloom, was missing, though the clasp had not been broken. A faint scent of bitter almonds clung to the air, quickly masked by perfume and confusion. Some claimed to have heard a faint gasp. Others insisted she had seemed unwell throughout the evening. Lady Anstruther, composed as ever, directed her household to secure the exits and forbid anyone from leaving until the authorities arrived. But tension rippled beneath her authority. There was something more at stake than mere scandal. In the drawing room, the guests gathered, now stripped of their easy gaiety, masks still in place, as if hiding from the shadow that had fallen over their night. Mrs. Violet March stood apart, her silver eyes unreadable behind her mask. Near the window, Sir Edward Gresham whispered urgently to his daughter, who blinked back tears. The Palmerton sisters exchanged nervous glances. A distant cousin from Vienna began to tremble uncontrollably. Detective Inspector Garrow, called in from Scotland Yard, began his initial inquiries with brisk efficiency. He found the guests an uncooperative tangle of contradictions and evasions. Lady Henrietta, he soon discovered, had been embroiled in a string of recent arguments, over investments, a contested will, and an unknown suitor. And yet, the more Garrow pressed, the more he sensed the presence of deeper secrets, unspoken alliances, and half-glimpsed motives glinting like shards of glass beneath the velvet surface. The scene, he noted, was almost theatrically arranged, a crime both intimate and public, as if designed to dazzle and distract. But amid the confusion, the grand French doors creaked open. A new figure stepped into the room, impeccably dressed in grey with a single white pocket square, eyes sharp as obsidian. Hercule Poirot, the celebrated Belgian detective, surveyed the room with serene composure, his moustache resplendent and his manner gracious. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot intoned, his voice at once soothing and commanding, "I beg your patience. If you permit, I shall assist in the search for truth and for justice, for I sense behind these masks and this tragedy a most curious puzzle." And so, as the clock struck midnight and the storm pressed against the manor's windows, the game began. One of secrets, deceit, and the delicate unraveling of the gossamer veil that separated truth from illusion. Chapter 2. The First Clues. Poirot moved through the tense drawing-room with the grace of a dancer, eyes flicking from one masked face to the next, absorbing every gesture and whisper. He paused before Lady Anstruther, who, though her poise never faltered, could not conceal the tremor in her voice. "Monsieur Poirot, I am deeply grateful for your presence. This is a tragedy for us all." "Oui, madame," he replied, bowing slightly. "Let us begin, if you please, with the circumstances. Who last saw Lady Henrietta before her collapse?" A hush fell. Mrs. Violet March, voice low and musical, stepped forward. "I was with her just before the waltz. She seemed distracted. She asked about my travels, but her eyes kept returning to the doors as if expecting someone. Then she excused herself, said she wished to speak privately to Sir Edward." Sir Edward, tall and severe, stiffened. "She approached me, yes. She asked after an investment, a most inappropriate subject for a ball. I told her we would discuss it another day. She was persistent, but I left her in the corridor near the library." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Did anyone see Lady Henrietta after that?" A hesitant voice answered. "A young woman, Miss Felicity Gresham, Sir Edward's daughter. I saw her just before the music ended. She was standing by the gallery doors, clutching her pearls and looking frightened. When she noticed me, she smiled quickly, but her hand was shaking." Poirot nodded, committing each detail to memory. "And the necklace? When did you last see it?" Felicity glanced at the inspector, cheeks flushed. She was still wearing it. The pearls caught the light. She always loved to show them off. Detective Inspector Garrow, not to be outdone, stepped forward. "The clasp was found fastened, but the pearls themselves are gone. The thread appears to have been carefully cut. No sign of them in the room, nor outside." Poirot tapped his finger against his lips. "So, there is a missing necklace, a sudden collapse, and an atmosphere charged with unease. Was there any quarrel? Any guests who departed the ballroom unexpectedly?" A butler, dignified and silent until now, offered his recollection. "Lady Henrietta argued with Miss Palmerston earlier in the evening. Something about a letter, but Miss Palmerston insisted the matter was trivial. She retired early." Poirot's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "A letter, you say? Was it delivered or intercepted?" "Lady Henrietta kept it in her handbag, monsieur. I saw her place it there, but after she collapsed, the bag was missing. We found it later in the cloakroom. Empty." The guests exchanged anxious looks. Poirot, kneeling beside the settee, examined the crushed fan in Lady Henrietta's lifeless hand. He studied the handle, ivory, splintered at the hinge, but clean. He lifted the glove from her fingers. Faint traces of powder dusted the inside, almost invisible. Poirot turned to the doctor. "Dr. Llewellyn, might I inquire, did you notice any unusual odor when you examined Lady Henrietta?" The doctor frowned. "Yes, a faint almond scent, but I found no trace of cyanide. Her pulse stopped abruptly, as if from shock or another subtler poison." Poirot's mustache twitched. "And the time of death?" "Within minutes of her leaving the ballroom. She could not have gone far." Poirot surveyed the room, his gaze lingering on each guest. "It is curious, n'est-ce pas, how the drama of life unfolds with such precision. The necklace, removed with skill, the handbag, emptied and planted, and a letter, mentioned by some but unseen by all." He moved to the window. On the sill, he found a small, greasy smudge, almost invisible but unmistakable to the practiced eye. Poirot took out his handkerchief and dabbed at it thoughtfully. Inspector Garrow, impatient, spoke up. "Is it not possible, Monsieur Poirot, that this was simple theft? The necklace, worth a fortune." Lady Henrietta's heart gave out in shock. Poirot inclined his head. "Perhaps, mon ami. But I have learned that when things seem simple, they are often layered. The truth is, she wears a veil, a gossamer one." As Poirot stepped back, his gaze settled momentarily on Mrs. Violet March, whose mask flickered with something like relief, or was it calculation? For an instant, a silent tension sparked between her and Sir Edward. Poirot made a mental note. The first threads had appeared in the tapestry of deceit, but the true pattern remained tantalizingly hidden. Chapter 3. The Gathering of Suspects. The guests were slowly drawn into the drawing room, as if summoned by an invisible force. Their faces, still veiled by the elaborate masks, betrayed the same unease that had clouded the atmosphere all evening. The storm outside, once a gentle murmur, had now turned into a furious wind, rattling the windows, adding to the feeling of confinement. Poirot, ever the meticulous observer, stood at the center of the room, his sharp eyes flicking from one guest to the next. His stance was relaxed, almost casual, but there was an air of concentration in the way he took in every detail, the way Sir Edward fidgeted with his cufflinks, the slight tremor in Miss Felicity Gresham's hand as she smoothed the front of her dress, and the quiet tension between Mrs. Violet March and Lady Anstruther, who had been exchanging glances all evening. "Let us begin," Poirot said, his voice soft yet commanding. "Each of you has a part to play in this little drama, and each of you has something to tell me. Do not attempt to deceive me. I know the truth is closer than it appears." The guests shifted uncomfortably, and Lady Anstruther took the lead, her voice steady. "Monsieur Poirot, I insist on your discretion in this matter. I trust that you will treat this situation with the utmost sensitivity." Poirot gave a small bow, acknowledging her request. "Madame, it is only the truth that I seek. Sensitivity is for the weak, but the truth is for the brave." Lady Anstruther's eyes tightened, but she did not speak again. Poirot turned his attention to the others, his gaze lingering on Mrs. March. "Mademoiselle March," he began, his accent soft but precise. "You seemed disquieted, no? When last I saw you, your expression was not one of concern for the dead, but rather of relief." Mrs. March raised an eyebrow, the corners of her lips curling into a slight smile. "Relief," she echoed, her voice low and velvety. "How strange. I was simply—" She paused, as if weighing her words carefully. "Disturbed. A sudden death does that to a person, does it not?" Poirot's gaze did not waver. "Ah, but there is something more to it, n'est-ce pas? A certain unease, perhaps at the thought of something unfinished." Mrs. March's smile faltered, but only for a moment. "I suppose one can never truly be finished with their affairs, can they? One is always left with something undone, some thread left loose." Poirot nodded slowly, taking in her every word. He turned next to Sir Edward Gresham, who had been standing apart from the group, looking uncharacteristically tense. "Ah, Sir Edward," Poirot said, his tone dripping with an almost theatrical interest. "You and Lady Henrietta, you had, shall we say, disagreements? Regarding her investments." Sir Edward stiffened, his hand tightening around his drink. "Lady Henrietta was a difficult woman to deal with," he said curtly, "but I have no idea how that has anything to do with her death." Poirot's eyes sparkled with an unspoken challenge. "You believe she died of natural causes? After a week of tense negotiations, and then a letter that mysteriously disappears?" Poirot's voice dropped, becoming colder. "No, I think it is more than coincidence." Sir Edward's expression tightened, but he said nothing. Poirot glanced at Miss Felicity Gresham, standing at the far end of the room, her posture rigid. "And you, Mademoiselle Gresham," Poirot continued, You were the last to see Lady Henrietta, yes? You were not concerned by her strange behavior." Miss Gresham took a deep breath before speaking, her voice laced with uncertainty. I wasn't sure what to think. She seemed distant, as if something were troubling her. But I had no reason to suspect anything was amiss. I thought she had simply been overwhelmed by the ball." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Ah, overwhelmed, yes. But did she mention anything unusual? Did she hint at any danger?" Miss Gresham hesitated, her gaze flicking nervously toward the window. "No, nothing of the sort. She only said that she wanted to speak to Sir Edward privately." Poirot's gaze lingered for a moment longer before he nodded, seemingly satisfied. He then turned to Lady Anstruther, who had been quiet up until now. "Madame," he said, his voice deliberate, "you are the hostess. You must know all that transpires in your home. What can you tell me about the relationships between the guests here? Surely you have seen the tensions, the whispers?" Lady Anstruther's lips twitched, but she quickly composed herself. "I have seen many things, Monsieur Poirot, but I will not pretend to understand the depths of every relationship. There are matters that remain private, even in the most intimate circles." Poirot inclined his head in understanding, but his sharp eyes did not miss the slight flush that colored her cheeks. He made a mental note of the exchange. The room was heavy with the weight of unsaid words, of tensions both subtle and obvious. Each guest was a piece of the puzzle, their motives wrapped in layers of suspicion and secrecy. But one thing was clear. Someone here was hiding the truth. Poirot's voice broke the silence once more. "I shall need more than polite words, mes amis. I need the truth, the whole truth, and I will find it, whether you assist me or not." As the guests shifted uneasily, Poirot's mind worked at a rapid pace, calculating, assessing, seeing what no one else could. The game had only just begun. Chapter 4. Poirot arrives. The room remained suffocatingly quiet as the guests shifted nervously under Poirot's penetrating gaze. He was a man of few words, but each sentence was calculated, each observation deliberate. It was as though he could see beyond the surfaces of the people standing before him, peering into their very souls, unraveling the threads of their carefully crafted facades. Poirot stepped back from the group, his eyes flicking to the windows where the storm still raged. He seemed unperturbed by the rising tension in the room, his movements measured and graceful, as though the chaos outside had no bearing on him. His thoughts were already processing, connecting the subtle clues that had been dropped, like breadcrumbs leading him toward the truth. "Now, mes amis," he said at last, breaking the silence, "we shall proceed with the investigation, as one must when the facts are obscured behind a veil of distraction." Lady Anstruther's gaze met Poirot's with an unreadable expression. "You believe this is more than just a tragic accident, then?" Poirot turned his eyes upon her, a small smile curling at the edges of his mouth. "Madame, when one observes the finer details, the seemingly inconsequential moments, one sees the pattern emerge. A tragedy? Perhaps. But this was no accident." A hushed murmur passed through the group, and Poirot began to pace, his sharp eyes flicking from one person to the next. The tension in the room thickened with every passing second. "Let us begin with the basics, shall we?" Poirot's voice remained calm, though there was a note of finality in his tone. Lady Henrietta was a woman of wealth, yes, but wealth alone does not make one a target. There must be something more, something deeper, something personal. He turned to Sir Edward Gresham, who was standing near the fireplace, his hand resting nervously on the mantel. "You, Sir Edward, were in the midst of a financial dispute with Lady Henrietta, were you not? A disagreement, perhaps, about investments or a business arrangement." Sir Edward stiffened at the mention of his name. I have no idea what you mean, Monsieur Poirot. We had a brief discussion, but it was hardly a dispute. Lady Henrietta was simply persistent, but we were on cordial terms." Poirot's gaze held steady. Cordial, you say? But did she not press you for an agreement that was unfavorable to you? Perhaps there was more to that conversation than you are letting on. Sir Edward's face flushed slightly. I told her I would consider her request. That's all. There is nothing sinister in it. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, but his eyes narrowed slightly. It is strange, is it not, that the one who would benefit the most from Lady Henrietta's death was so concerned with appearing innocent. Turning away from Sir Edward, Poirot addressed Mrs. Violet March. You, madame, you have a peculiar way of avoiding questions. You have been here, in this house, for several days, yet when I asked you earlier about Lady Henrietta, you spoke of her only in passing, as if you did not know her well. But I suspect, madame, that you knew her more intimately than you admit. Mrs. March met his gaze without flinching. I knew Lady Henrietta, of course, she said smoothly, her voice low and controlled. But what of it? Many people here knew her. What does that have to do with her death? Poirot's lips twitched into a slight smile, though his eyes remained hard. Ah, but that is the crux of the matter, madame. You see, everyone here had something to hide. A secret, perhaps. A lie told to preserve a reputation or a fortune. Poirot paused, letting the words sink in. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of suspicion hanging heavily in the air. Poirot's mind was already racing ahead, linking the threads of their stories, analyzing every word, every gesture. He turned to Miss Felicity Gresham, who had been standing quietly by the window, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. And you, Mademoiselle Gresham, Poirot continued, his voice gentle but piercing. What do you know of your father's dealings with Lady Henrietta? Was there anything that might have led to this tragic event? Miss Gresham's eyes flickered, but she said nothing. Poirot's gaze lingered for a moment before moving on. Ah, but there is one more piece to this puzzle, Poirot continued, stepping back from the group. Something that has been right under our noses all along. He turned his attention to the door, where the faintest trace of a footprint could be seen on the polished wood, a faint smear almost imperceptible to the untrained eye. But to Poirot, it was as clear as day. The answer, mes amis, is closer than you think, Poirot said, his voice taking on a steely edge, and I shall uncover it, piece by piece. The room grew quieter as Poirot's eyes shifted from the suspects to the door. He had the feeling that the truth was waiting just beyond that threshold, ready to be revealed. The storm outside had nothing on the storm that was about to break in the Palmerton Hall. Chapter 5. Initial interviews begin. The tension in the room had shifted imperceptibly. Poirot stood at the center, his keen eyes scanning each guest with an intensity that was both unsettling and fascinating. The storm outside intensified, and the rain battered the windows, as though the very elements conspired to echo the mounting sense of dread within the walls of Palmerton Hall. Now, mes amis, Poirot said, his voice low but commanding. We must begin in earnest. I shall interview each of you, one by one. Do not think you can hide behind your masks and fine clothes. The truth will come to light. Lady Anstruther, who had been silent until now, gave a sharp nod, her eyes flickering toward the door. Of course, Monsieur Poirot, we trust your expertise, but please, do not let this drag on for too long. Poirot's gaze remained fixed on her for a moment before he turned to Sir Edward Gresham. Sir Edward, you shall go first. The tension between Poirot and Sir Edward was palpable as the latter reluctantly made his way to a chair, his face tight, betraying a deep unease. Poirot took a seat opposite him, folding his hands neatly in his lap. Let us begin then, Sir Edward. You and Lady Henrietta, as I understand it, had frequent business dealings. Were these dealings purely professional, or was there something personally involved? Poirot's voice was gentle, but there was an underlying sharpness in the question. Sir Edward shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It was all business, Poirot. Nothing more, I can assure you of that. His words came quickly, too quickly, as if he were trying to convince himself more than anyone else. Poirot studied him, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. And yet, Sir Edward, you were the last person to see Lady Henrietta alive. I would say your business with her was more than just formal, no? Sir Edward stiffened. I already told you. I left her in the corridor. We spoke of investments, nothing more. She was excitable, but there was no reason for me to suspect anything would happen. Poirot made a small, thoughtful noise. Excitable, you say? Did she give any indication that she was concerned? Fearful, perhaps? Sir Edward hesitated, his fingers tapping nervously on the armrest of the chair. She seemed unsettled. But no, she didn't seem frightened. If anything, she was just frustrated with me. She wanted a decision, and I couldn't give it to her. She was a difficult woman in that regard. Poirot nodded, his gaze never leaving Sir Edward. Yes, a difficult woman indeed. And yet, Sir Edward, it is often those with the most power who mask their true motives behind a veil of propriety. Do you not think that Lady Henrietta may have felt betrayed? Sir Edward's face flushed, and he opened his mouth to respond, but Poirot was already turning his attention to the next person in the room. Thank you, Sir Edward. That will be all for now. Mademoiselle Gresham, you are next. Poirot's voice was calm, but his eyes seemed to pierce through her as she nervously rose from her seat. Miss Felicity Gresham moved toward him, her expression a careful mask of composure, though the faint tremor in her hands betrayed her anxiety. She sat across from Poirot, folding her hands tightly in her lap. Now, Mademoiselle Gresham, Poirot began, his tone softer now. You were the last to see Lady Henrietta alive, yes? What can you tell me about her behavior at that time? Was she acting strangely? Miss Gresham's voice was barely above a whisper. Lady Henrietta was agitated. She kept asking about my father and whether he had agreed to her terms. She was desperate for an answer, but I didn't know how to help her. Did she mention anything specific about those terms? Poirot asked, leaning forward slightly. Miss Gresham swallowed hard before answering. She said it was a matter of great importance, something that could change everything, but she didn't elaborate. She didn't trust me enough, I think, to tell me the full details. Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest. And did she seem fearful, Mademoiselle Gresham? Was there any sign that she felt threatened by someone? Miss Gresham shook her head, but Poirot could see the uncertainty in her eyes. No, she didn't mention anything like that, but I had the sense that she was hiding something from me. She seemed afraid of something, but it wasn't clear what. Poirot gave a small nod, as if the pieces were beginning to fall into place. I see. You believe she was hiding something important, something that could explain her agitation. Miss Gresham nodded, though she seemed increasingly uncomfortable under Poirot's gaze. Yes, she was always so composed, always in control. But that night, she was different. I don't know what happened between her and my father, but I felt like something had shifted. Poirot took a moment to absorb her words, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the armrest. Thank you, Mademoiselle Gresham. You have been most helpful. He turned to the others, his gaze sweeping over the room. Each one of them had something to hide, and each piece of the puzzle seemed to be falling into place. But there was something that still eluded him. Something subtle, something hidden beneath the surface. Poirot stood, his expression impassive but his mind whirring with connections and contradictions. I shall need to speak with the others now. The truth, it seems, is a matter of patience, but it will be revealed in time. The guests exchanged uneasy glances as Poirot turned toward the door. It was clear that the game was only just beginning, and the stakes had never been higher. Chapter 6. First, false lead. The investigation had taken on a new weight, a sense of urgency that had been missing before. As Poirot continued to sift through the evidence, each new detail seemed to add layers to the mystery, but none of them offered the clarity he sought. The guests, each one carrying their own secrets, were more than just suspects. They were actors in a drama whose conclusion was yet to be written, and Poirot, with his unparalleled intellect, was determined to write the final act. With his methodical pace, Poirot had begun to piece together the scattered clues, yet the uncertainty still lingered. He had gathered enough information for a theory, but it felt incomplete, as if one crucial detail was missing. To push the investigation forward, he decided it was time to take a bolder approach. That evening, Poirot convened a second round of interviews. The atmosphere in Palmerton Hall had grown heavier, the storm outside now mirroring the storm of suspicions that had gathered within. Poirot glanced at his watch, noting the time. It was close to the hour when most people's guard would begin to drop, when the truth could slip out unnoticed. First to be called in was Sir Edward Gresham. The man walked into the room, his expression hard, his movements tense. Poirot studied him carefully, noting the telltale signs of stress that the man could not entirely conceal. "Sir Edward, we are at a critical point in this investigation," Poirot began, his tone neutral but piercing. "You see, it is often the most obvious explanation that is the one that leads us astray. That, I believe, is what we must consider now." Sir Edward raised an eyebrow, his face a picture of carefully controlled annoyance. "And what, precisely, do you mean by that, Poirot?" Poirot leaned forward slightly, his hands folded neatly in front of him. What if Lady Henrietta's death was not the result of some grand conspiracy, but rather the result of a simple mistake? Sir Edward stiffened. "A mistake? How could you possibly suggest such a thing?" Poirot smiled ever so slightly. "A mistake, Sir Edward, can be a deadly thing. A poorly placed word, a slip of the tongue, or perhaps even an unspoken threat, one that was not intended to be taken seriously. After all, who better to be deceived by their own emotions than a man who believes he has everything to gain?" Sir Edward's hand clenched around the armrest, his face flushing. "This is preposterous," he muttered. But there was something about his eyes, something that betrayed doubt. Poirot continued, undeterred by Sir Edward's protests. "And yet, the facts suggest something very different, do they not? The missing necklace, the broken fan, the peculiar way the body was discovered, it all points to something amiss. But you see, Sir Edward, I believe the solution to this crime is simpler than it appears." Sir Edward's breathing had quickened, his voice now betraying more frustration than before. "If you're insinuating—" "I am not insinuating, Sir Edward," Poirot interrupted, his voice smooth as velvet but sharp beneath. "I am stating that the truth may be simpler than any of us care to admit. The woman was a difficult person, yes, but that does not necessarily make her death a matter of intrigue." Poirot paused, allowing his words to sink in. Sir Edward remained silent, his gaze now fixed on the floor. Poirot knew the man was reconsidering his own actions, second-guessing his defense. The slightest crack in his armor had appeared, but it was not yet enough. The door creaked open, and Poirot turned his attention to the next guest, Mrs. Violet March. Her eyes met his with a cold, calculating gaze, but beneath it, Poirot could sense her unease. "Mademoiselle March, what of the necklace?" Poirot began, his voice calm and probing. "It was important, was it not? A priceless heirloom, the sort of thing that could spark a great deal of tension among family members." Mrs. March's lips tightened and she stood straighter, her expression giving nothing away. "I have no idea what you're insinuating, Poirot, but if you think I had anything to do with this tragedy, then you're mistaken." Poirot's eyes softened as he studied her. "A tragedy, yes. But is it possible, madame, that this tragedy was no accident? That someone here, under the pressure of their own desires, made a mistake that led to something far worse than they intended?" Mrs. March's eyes flashed for a moment before she regained her composure. "You are grasping at straws, Poirot. There is nothing more to it than what has already been said." Poirot smiled, though his mind was already racing ahead, considering all the possibilities. He had not yet made up his mind, but he knew that something was not right. The pieces of the puzzle were still too scattered, but he could feel them beginning to shift. "I see," Poirot said softly, "but perhaps, madame, it is the simplest of explanations that holds the key. I shall let you go for now, but remember this. You cannot hide forever from the truth." As Mrs. March turned to leave, Poirot's gaze followed her. He had not yet revealed his full theory, but he was closer now than ever before. The false leads had begun to form, and yet, as he had suspected, they would only serve to lead him back to the truth. The game was afoot. Chapter 7. The Psychological Game. The drawing room had grown quieter with each passing hour, the weight of Poirot's probing questions hanging heavily in the air. The guests, still masked by their pretenses, exchanged wary glances as they awaited their turn under his scrutiny. Poirot, ever the master of patience, had no intention of rushing the unraveling of the truth. He knew, instinctively, that the key to solving this mystery lay not in the facts alone, but in the human emotions that swirled beneath them. Poirot had made his rounds, speaking with each guest, allowing their stories to unfold and their secrets to reveal themselves, often in the subtlest of ways. The interviews had led nowhere conclusive, but Poirot had begun to see patterns emerging from the chaos. It was now time to take a more delicate approach, one that involved pushing his suspects to their limits, drawing out their hidden fears, their deepest insecurities. The truth, he knew, could only be uncovered through psychological pressure. It was Lady Anstruthers' turn now. She had been a steady presence throughout the investigation, poised and calm, her every word measured. Poirot had sensed that there was more to her than met the eye, and now he intended to draw it out. "Madame," Poirot began, his tone smooth and careful, "I've been thinking of our earlier conversation. You spoke of the tragedy with such grace, but I wonder, what do you know of the relationships between your guests? You are the hostess, after all. You must see things that others do not." Lady Anstruthers' face remained an unreadable mask, but Poirot could see the slightest twitch at the corner of her lips. "I have always prided myself on being a good hostess, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice steady, "but I assure you there is no hidden drama among my guests. We are all simply people trying to enjoy an evening." Poirot's eyes never left hers as he leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. "Ah, but it is the people who hide the most who are often the most fascinating, no? You must admit that. Tell me, Lady Anstruther, did you know that your friend, Mrs. March, had a personal relationship with Lady Henrietta? A more intimate one?" Lady Anstruther's breath caught for the briefest moment, but she recovered quickly. "What do you mean by intimate?" she asked, her eyes narrowing just slightly. Poirot's lips curled into a small smile. "Ah, the very fact that you ask that question tells me something. You see, madame, the question is not so much about what I mean, but about what you know. I've learned that Mrs. March and Lady Henrietta were not simply acquaintances, but, shall we say, business partners of sorts. Perhaps Lady Henrietta was blackmailing her." The shock on Lady Anstruther's face was fleeting, but Poirot caught it nonetheless. "That is a lie," she hissed, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Lady Henrietta was no saint, but she was not involved in anything like that. Poirot studied her carefully, the silence between them thickening. "Of course, madame. You know her better than anyone. But tell me this, did Mrs. March have anything to gain from Lady Henrietta's death?" Lady Anstruther faltered for just a second before she composed herself. "No. She had nothing to gain. This is nonsense." Poirot nodded, acknowledging her protest, but he knew that the cracks in her armor were beginning to show. Very well, madame, but I suspect that there are things you have not yet shared, things you have hidden from me. I will wait. Everyone's true nature reveals itself eventually. He turned away from her, his attention shifting to the next person, Miss Felicity Gresham. She had been quiet for the most part, standing by the window with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was pale, her expression distant, as though she were lost in thought. Poirot approached her slowly, deliberately, his gaze never leaving her. "Mademoiselle Gresham," Poirot said gently, "you seem troubled. Is something on your mind?" Miss Gresham looked at him, startled, as if she had been pulled from a deep reverie. "No, Monsieur Poirot," she replied, her voice steady but lacking conviction. "I'm fine." Poirot smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Of course, you are fine, but I think you have been keeping something from me, mademoiselle. There is something about Lady Henrietta's death that bothers you, something you are not telling me." Miss Gresham stiffened, her eyes widening just slightly. "I don't know what you mean," she said, though her voice wavered ever so slightly. Poirot's eyes sparkled with the quiet amusement of a man who had just cornered his prey. "Ah, but you do, mademoiselle. You have been close to Sir Edward Gresham, have you not? And you know that Lady Henrietta's death was not as simple as it appears. You are hiding something, and I intend to find it." Miss Gresham's face flushed, and for a moment she seemed to struggle with herself, as though weighing the consequences of speaking the truth. Finally, she exhaled sharply and shook her head. I don't know what you're talking about, Monsieur Poirot." "I didn't do anything." Poirot studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "We shall see, mademoiselle. We shall see." As Miss Gresham left the room, Poirot's mind raced, each new bit of information adding to the growing complexity of the case. The psychological game he was playing with these suspects had only just begun, and he could feel it building. Every word, every gesture was a calculated move. But the truth was not yet within his reach. The storm outside raged on, its fury mirroring the storm of suspicions that had enveloped Palmerston Hall. But Poirot was undeterred. The pieces would fall into place in time, and when they did, the truth would be revealed, no matter how long it took. Chapter 8. A secondary mystery. The investigation was beginning to take on a new layer of complexity. Poirot had his suspects, each with their own motivations, each hiding something, but something still felt off. He could sense it in the air, in the way the guests responded to him, in the way they hesitated when answering his questions. They were hiding their truths, yes, but it wasn't just one secret that lay at the heart of this mystery. There was something deeper, something more sinister, a hidden connection that was yet to be uncovered. The evening had drawn on, and Poirot's patience was wearing thin. He had made his rounds, questioned the suspects, and observed their every move, but the breakthrough he needed still eluded him. Then, as if on cue, a sudden commotion broke the tense atmosphere in the room. It was Miss Felicity Gresham who entered, her face pale and her eyes wide with panic. Her breath was short, and she appeared completely out of breath, as though she had just run across the estate. "Mon Dieu," Poirot muttered under his breath, immediately rising to his feet. "What is it, mademoiselle?" Miss Gresham struggled to speak, her voice trembling. There's been another incident, another crime." Poirot's sharp eyes met hers, and without a word, he motioned for her to sit. "Explain, mademoiselle." "Slowly." Felicity took a deep breath, her hands shaking as she gripped the edge of the chair. "It's Lady Anstruther's study. I was passing by when I noticed the door was slightly ajar. She paused, her eyes flicking nervously around the room before continuing. "I looked inside, and there, on the desk, was a letter addressed to Sir Edward. But that wasn't the strange part." Poirot's brow furrowed. "Go on." "The letter was partially burned," she continued, her voice growing more frantic. The edges were singed, as if someone had tried to destroy it, but I could still make out parts of the text, and there was a name I've never seen before. Poirot's pulse quickened, though he showed no outward sign of it. A name? Tell me, mademoiselle. What was it? Felicity hesitated, her lips trembling. It was Henrietta. Poirot leaned forward, his eyes intense. Henrietta? Which Henrietta? That's the thing, Miss Gresham replied. The letter, it mentioned Henrietta. But it wasn't Lady Henrietta Poirot, it was someone else. Someone I don't know. The name was Henrietta Devereux. Poirot's mind raced, the pieces clicking together with lightning speed. Henrietta Devereux, he repeated, as if testing the name. He had not expected this. Another Henrietta, one buried deeper than the others, whose presence had remained hidden until now. Did you see anything else, mademoiselle? Anything that could explain the letter? Poirot's voice was calm, but the underlying urgency in his tone was palpable. Miss Gresham shook her head. No, just that. The letter had been torn. Some of it was missing, and there was no sign of who had written it. But I'm sure it's important. I don't know why, but I felt it the moment I saw it. Poirot's gaze turned inward as he considered this new information. Another layer of the mystery had emerged, one that involved a woman named Henrietta Devereux. Whoever she was, her connection to the crime was becoming clearer by the moment. But what did this letter mean? And why had it been burned? There were too many questions, too many unanswered pieces. The tension in the room was thickening, but Poirot had learned to trust his instincts. He knew that this new revelation was no accident. The name Henrietta Devereux was not a coincidence. It was a thread that could unravel everything. I must see this letter, mademoiselle, Poirot said, his tone firm. I shall examine it for myself. We cannot afford to let this matter slip through our fingers. Miss Gresham nodded, still trembling but clearly relieved to have spoken her piece. She stood and led Poirot to Lady Anstruther's study, her footsteps echoing in the silence of the house. As they reached the door, Poirot's mind worked quickly, piecing together the fragments of information he had gathered. There was something more to Lady Henrietta's death, something far more intricate than he had initially imagined. The letter was key. He was certain of it. Inside the study, Poirot's eyes immediately fell on the desk where Miss Gresham had said the letter had been found. The room was dim, lit only by the flickering light of a single candle. Poirot moved swiftly, his gloved hands examining the desk with meticulous care. The letter lay there, still partially charred, its contents barely legible. The name Henrietta Devereux was faint but unmistakable. It was real. This was not a trick of the light. Poirot's eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. The game had shifted once again, and the truth was finally beginning to take shape. But there were still many questions to answer, and the clock was ticking. Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. The letter was a revelation, but it had opened more doors than it had closed. Henrietta Devereux. The name repeated in Poirot's mind like a haunting refrain. Who was she? And what was her connection to Lady Henrietta Poirot? More importantly, why had this name been hidden in the shadows, veiled by the layers of lies and half-truths? Poirot had his suspicions, but the puzzle was not yet complete. After carefully examining the remnants of the letter, Poirot stood, his gaze lingering on the ashes and burnt edges. He had found little else to clarify the connection between the two Henriettas. The letter was inconclusive, but Poirot knew that this small fragment was enough to set the investigation on a new course. It was no longer just a simple case of murder. It was a labyrinth of tangled relationships, secrets, and ambitions, all concealed beneath the polished surface of Palmerton Hall. Poirot returned to the drawing room, where the guests remained in uneasy silence. The storm outside still pounding against the windows. The guests had been waiting for him to return, their nerves fraying as the minutes passed. Each one seemed to be lost in their own thoughts, unwilling to meet his gaze. They were all hiding something. Poirot was certain of it. He looked at each of them in turn: Sir Edward Gresham, Mrs. Violet March, Miss Felicity Gresham, and Lady Anstruther. All of them had been under suspicion at some point, and all of them had something to hide. The question was, which one had the most to lose? Poirot's eyes fell on Sir Edward, standing near the fireplace, his back straight, his expression one of barely contained frustration. "Sir Edward," Poirot said, his voice cutting through the silence, "I've been thinking about your connection to Lady Henrietta. I wonder if you might tell me a bit more about your recent dealings with her." Sir Edward's eyes flicked toward Poirot, but he did not speak immediately. Poirot watched him carefully, noting the slight tightening of his jaw, the subtle shift of his posture. Sir Edward had something to hide. Poirot could feel it in the air between them. "I've already told you, Poirot," Sir Edward replied, his voice strained. "We had some business dealings. She wanted a decision, but I couldn't give it to her. That's all there was to it." Poirot studied him, then nodded slowly. "I see. But I wonder, Sir Edward, if there is something you are leaving out. Something important." Sir Edward looked away, his gaze flickering toward the window. "I've told you everything I know. I had nothing to do with her death." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And yet, you were the last to see her alive, were you not?" The silence in the room thickened as Sir Edward shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, I was. But I didn't kill her, Poirot." Poirot allowed the words to linger in the air before turning his attention to Mrs. Violet March, who had been standing by the window, her arms crossed, a look of quiet disdain on her face. Her eyes met his, cold and calculating, but Poirot could see the flicker of something deeper beneath the surface. "Mademoiselle March," Poirot began, his tone still calm, "you have been quite silent during the investigation. I wonder, what is it that you are hiding?" Mrs. March's lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm hiding nothing, Monsieur Poirot. I'm simply not as prone to dramatics as some of the others here." Poirot's gaze never wavered as he took a step closer to her. "Perhaps you do not wish to reveal something that could cast doubt on your involvement in this affair?" Mrs. March laughed softly, but the sound was hollow. "I have nothing to hide, Poirot. But if you must ask, I would say that I find this whole situation tiresome. The death of Lady Henrietta has nothing to do with me." Poirot regarded her for a long moment. "Of course, madame. But I believe there is more to your story. Something hidden beneath your polished exterior. You will, of course, tell me when you are ready." Mrs. March's smile faltered, but she did not reply. Poirot turned to Miss Felicity Gresham, who had been standing quietly, her hands clenched tightly in front of her. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of anxiety and fear. "Mademoiselle Gresham," Poirot said gently, "I wonder if you might be more forthcoming now. You were the last to see Lady Henrietta before her death. You were also the one who found the letter, yes?" Miss Gresham nodded slowly, her lips trembling. "Yes, Monsieur Poirot, but I don't know anything more about the letter. I only saw what was left of it, and I thought it was important. But I didn't want to get involved." Poirot leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Mademoiselle, the truth has a way of revealing itself when we least expect it. Perhaps the letter has more significance than you realize." Felicity looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "I don't know what to do." Poirot nodded, his expression softening just slightly. "You do not need to say anything more, mademoiselle. But the truth is always closer than we think, and it is often those who are most afraid of it who know the most." The room fell silent once more, as Poirot's gaze shifted from one guest to the next. They were all hiding something, all connected by threads that they refused to acknowledge. But the game was far from over. Poirot knew that the hidden connections between them. Chapter 10. Poirot's Secret Clue. Poirot sat alone in the study, eyes fixed on the charred letter beneath the lamplight. The guests' evasions and the storm's ceaseless rage outside formed a kind of pressure cooker, and yet he knew the solution lay not in bold confrontations, but in the smallest, most overlooked details. He let the silence press in, listening to his thoughts and the soft crackle of the fire. The remains of the letter haunted him. Henrietta Devereux. Not Lady Henrietta Poirot, but someone else entirely. The way the name appeared, half-burnt, half-visible, suggested deliberate action. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Why burn part of a letter and leave the name exposed? It was a signal, not a mistake. He rose and paced the room, reviewing every step of the day. The necklace. Missing, but removed so carefully there was no break in the clasp. The fan, crushed in Lady Henrietta's hand, as if she'd grabbed for something in her last moment. And now, the name, a ghost from the past or a false trail? Poirot's mind traced patterns through the chaos, searching for order. He returned to the desk and examined the ink smudge again. It was not random. The angle, the pressure. It was the mark of a left-handed writer, and he recalled none of the suspects as left-handed. A small thing, yet so telling. Poirot's little grey cells sparked to life, spinning connections between the left-handed letter, the necklace, and the web of lies in the room beyond. Poirot knew he must test the truth quietly. He called for Miss Felicity Gresham under the guise of further questions about the letter. She entered, nervous and pale, her eyes flickering to the desk. Poirot watched her hands. She was right-handed. As they spoke, he gently steered the conversation, mentioning how sometimes people mask their identities in writing. She stiffened, but volunteered nothing. As she left, Poirot's gaze followed her, mind racing. Next, he summoned Mrs. Violet March. He observed how she handled the letter, her careful touch betraying a kind of practiced delicacy. Poirot offered her a pen to jot down an address, watching. She used her right hand, hesitation, but no obvious sign of deceit, yet something about her composure lingered in his thoughts. The house grew quieter as the hour drew late. Poirot moved to the sitting room where Sir Edward lingered, nursing a drink by the window. Poirot made conversation about the storm, then remarked on how people reveal more in their smallest actions. Sir Edward bristled, replying tersely, but did not betray himself. It was only when Poirot was left alone again, the guests dispersed to their rooms, that clarity arrived. He returned to the desk, carefully lifting the burnt paper once more. He realized the signature, Henrietta Devereux, was penned in a distinctly different style from the body of the letter. Two hands at work, one after the other. The writer and the forger. Someone had tried to plant a false clue. Poirot's heart raced. The burnt letter, meant to implicate another, was the work of someone in this house. Someone desperate to direct suspicion away from themselves. The left-handed clue, the forced burning, the threads all pointed to an inside job. The next morning, Poirot would gather everyone, but tonight he allowed himself a small, knowing smile. The secret clue was his alone for now, a weapon in his silent war against the Gossamer veil of deception. Chapter 11. Tensions rise. The storm had not abated by the morning, and the heavy rain continued to batter the windows of Palmerton Hall, setting a grim backdrop for the unfolding drama within. Poirot had spent the night in quiet reflection, the puzzle pieces shifting in his mind like pieces of a complex chess game. There was still much to uncover, but the revelations he'd made so far had already begun to expose the cracks in the carefully constructed facades of the guests. When the morning sun finally broke through the heavy clouds, it did little to lift the oppressive atmosphere in the house. The air was thick with tension, each of the guests walking on eggshells as they gathered in the drawing room for the next round of questioning. Poirot, as always, was calm at the center of the storm. He had already set his plan in motion. It was time to apply subtle pressure to see who would crack, who would betray themselves, and who would remain resolute in their silence. He knew that the truth was closer than ever, but the final pieces were still scattered. It was time to let the suspects turn on each other. Lady Anstruther was the first to enter the room. As always, she carried herself with a measured elegance, but her sharp eyes betrayed the worry gnawing at her insides. Poirot, watching her closely, saw the faintest trace of a tremor in her fingers as she reached for her tea. "Madame," Poirot began, his voice smooth and probing, "how are you feeling this morning? No lingering doubts from last night, I hope?" Lady Anstruther's gaze shifted to him, but she managed a polite smile. "I'm well, Monsieur Poirot. I've had a sleepless night, of course, but such things are to be expected when one is hosting a tragedy." Poirot tilted his head. "A tragedy, yes, but not one without its mysteries. Tell me, madame, have you had the chance to think of any of the clues I presented yesterday?" Lady Anstruther's smile faded slightly, but she recovered quickly. "I believe I told you everything I know, Monsieur Poirot. I cannot help you beyond that." Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. "Of course. But you must understand, madame, when one is under scrutiny, even the smallest gesture can speak volumes. Perhaps it is time for you to reconsider your actions." Lady Anstruther stiffened. "What do you mean by that?" Poirot raised his hands in mock surrender. "Merely a thought, madame. You see, sometimes a person's discomfort is not born from guilt, but from the fear of something hidden, something not yet uncovered." Lady Anstruther's eyes darted briefly to the others in the room, but she said nothing more. Poirot allowed the silence to linger before turning his attention to Miss Felicity Gresham, who had been standing quietly by the window, her back straight and her gaze far off. "Mademoiselle Gresham," Poirot began, his voice gentle but insistent, "I wonder if you might speak more freely now. It seems you have been holding something back, something important." Felicity's posture stiffened, and for the briefest moment, Poirot saw the flicker of fear in her eyes. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Poirot took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "Ah, but you do, mademoiselle. You know more than you're willing to admit. You were the one to find the letter. Why does that letter trouble you so? Why is it that you cannot let go of it?" Felicity's fingers twisted together in her lap, but she remained silent. Poirot could see her emotions bubbling just beneath the surface, her control slipping with each passing moment. He pressed further. "You saw something in that letter, didn't you? You saw something that scared you. Perhaps something that implicates someone in this very room." Felicity's breath caught in her throat, but she managed to hold her ground. "No, I don't know anything." Poirot nodded slowly, though his eyes remained sharp. "Very well, mademoiselle. But remember, the truth is never as far away as it seems. Sometimes it is simply a matter of looking at things from a different angle." He turned next to Sir Edward Gresham, whose expression had become harder and more distant since their previous conversation. "Sir Edward," Poirot began, his voice calm but penetrating, "you were the one who last saw Lady Henrietta alive. You've told me before that you had no reason to suspect her death would come to pass so suddenly. But tell me, did she seem anxious? Did she say anything unusual to you in those final moments?" Sir Edward's gaze darkened, and for a moment, Poirot could see the flicker of something in his eyes. "I told you before, Poirot. I wasn't the last one to speak with her. She was just a woman with her own problems, nothing more." Poirot tilted his head. "Nothing more. But isn't it curious, Sir Edward, that you would be so quick to dismiss her death as nothing more than a coincidence? It seems that you may be hiding a great deal of indifference toward her fate." The tension between Poirot and Sir Edward grew palpable, the air thick with unspoken accusation. Sir Edward clenched his jaw, his hands tightening around the armrest. "I've told you what I know. You can twist my words however you like, but you will not make me out to be guilty." Poirot studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "We shall see, Sir Edward. We shall see." Chapter 12. The Confrontation. The air in Palmerton Hall had grown thick with uncertainty. The guests, once elegant in their politeness, now found themselves drawn into a web of suspicion and intrigue. Poirot had not yet uncovered all the answers, but with each word spoken, with each subtle move, he felt the threads tightening around those responsible. They could not hide forever. Poirot stood by the window, watching the rain lash against the glass. The storm outside mirrored the storm that was unfolding within the walls of the grand estate. His mind worked furiously, calculating, connecting, testing his theories against the reactions of those in the room. He had seen enough to know that something crucial was about to reveal itself. Turning from the window, Poirot addressed the group once more, his tone measured, almost casual. "I believe we are now at the most crucial point of this investigation. The truth is within our reach, but it requires all of us to face it head-on." Lady Anstruther, who had been sitting quietly at the far end of the room, straightened in her chair. Her eyes met Poirot's, and though her face was serene, the tension in her posture was palpable. "Monsieur Poirot, I've told you all I know. I have no further secrets to reveal." Poirot's gaze never wavered as he replied, his voice soft but firm. "Ah, but you see, madame, the secrets are not just yours to reveal. Everyone here is entangled in this mystery. Every word spoken, every gesture made, has left its mark." He turned his attention to Sir Edward Gresham, who had been fidgeting nervously with his cufflinks. "Sir Edward, you were the last to speak with Lady Henrietta. Yet you have been so insistent that her death was nothing more than an unfortunate event. Is that truly the case, or are you simply trying to distance yourself from something far darker?" Sir Edward's face reddened, and he clenched his fists. "I've already told you, Poirot. I had no part in her death. I didn't even know she would die." Poirot studied him carefully, then nodded, almost as though conceding a point. "Perhaps. But you see, Sir Edward, it is not just about what you knew. It is about what you didn't know. The letter, the missing necklace, the lie about your relationship with Lady Henrietta. None of these things add up." Poirot's eyes flicked to Mrs. Violet March, who had been standing by the fireplace, her arms crossed. Her calm demeanor had cracked slightly in the past days, but she still carried herself with a composed elegance. "Mademoiselle March," Poirot began, his tone slightly more pointed, "you are the one who has been most elusive in this investigation. It is as though you are playing a game, withholding the truth from all of us." Mrs. March stiffened at his words, but her lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "You misunderstand, Monsieur Poirot. I've already said everything I know. If you suspect me, then you are mistaken." Poirot's expression remained unchanged as he continued, "You claim to know nothing, but I believe you are far more involved than you are letting on. You had a relationship with Lady Henrietta, yes? A relationship that went beyond mere friendship. Perhaps it was not as innocent as you'd like us to believe?" For the first time, Mrs. March's smile faltered, and a flicker of something, fear, guilt, flashed in her eyes. She quickly regained her composure, but Poirot had seen enough. He turned his attention to Miss Felicity Gresham, who had been standing in the corner, her eyes cast downward. "Mademoiselle Gresham," Poirot said gently, "you were the last to see the letter, yes? You found it in Lady Anstruther's study, and yet you seem reluctant to share more details. What did you see? What did that letter truly mean?" Felicity's hands trembled in her lap, and she seemed unable to meet his gaze. I didn't understand what it meant, Monsieur Poirot. The name Henrietta Devereux was just a name. I didn't know it was important." Poirot nodded, his eyes softening with a quiet understanding. "I see. But you must understand, mademoiselle, that a name is never just a name in a case such as this. It is a key, a doorway to a truth that lies just beyond our grasp. That letter contained more than you realize. The tension in the room thickened as Poirot allowed his words to hang in the air. Everyone had a motive, everyone had something to hide, but it was the smallest of actions, the smallest of words, that would reveal the true culprit. Poirot paused, taking a step back as he surveyed the room. The walls, the furniture, the storm outside, it all seemed to close in on the group. They were trapped in the mystery they had created, and the final piece of the puzzle was within reach. But before Poirot could speak again, the door to the room opened with a creak, and the butler, who had been absent for most of the investigation, stepped in. His expression was serious, almost grim. "Excuse me, Monsieur Poirot," the butler said. "There is something you need to see. It's urgent." Poirot's eyes narrowed as he motioned for the butler to proceed. "Lead the way," he said, his voice steady but his mind racing with anticipation. The truth was closer than ever, but the final twist was yet to reveal itself. Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape. The butler led Poirot down the narrow corridor, his steps swift and purposeful. The air felt thick with anticipation, the unease among the guests now palpable as they gathered in the drawing-room, murmuring in low tones. Each of them seemed to sense that the investigation was nearing its conclusion, and the sense of impending revelation weighed heavily on them all. Poirot's mind raced as he followed the butler, his thoughts moving at a pace faster than his feet could carry him. Every guest in the house had something to hide, some secret they had worked to protect. And now, it seemed, that secret was about to break open. But what had prompted this new development? What had the butler found that required immediate attention? The butler stopped before a small door at the end of the hallway. He motioned for Poirot to enter, and Poirot did so without hesitation, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of the unexpected. The room was dimly lit, filled with old bookshelves and a single desk cluttered with papers. At the far end, something unusual caught his attention. A heavy coat, its collar turned up, was thrown carelessly over a chair. A pair of boots stood beside it, their soles caked in mud. Poirot's gaze shifted to the desk, where a piece of paper had been hastily scribbled with a single urgent sentence. "I cannot be found." Poirot moved forward, his heart racing with the thrill of discovery. He picked up the note, examining it closely. The handwriting was hurried, the ink slightly smeared. The message was simple but direct. Someone was trying to escape, fleeing from something they feared would be revealed. As he stood there, Poirot's mind worked quickly, piecing the events together. The coat, the mud-stained boots, and now this note. Someone had been preparing to leave in a hurry. But who? And why? A soft sound from behind caught Poirot's attention. He turned swiftly, his sharp eyes narrowing as he spotted the figure standing in the doorway. It was Mrs. Violet March. Her face, usually composed and calculating, was now pale, her lips trembling. She stepped into the room, her eyes flicking nervously between Poirot and the desk. "Monsieur Poirot," she began, her voice low but steady, "you should not be here. There is nothing for you to find." Poirot studied her closely, his mind racing. She had not anticipated his discovery, and now her mask was slipping. "Madame, I believe you are mistaken," Poirot said, his voice smooth but firm. "It seems to me that there is quite a bit for me to find." Mrs. March's eyes widened as she took a step backward, her hand instinctively reaching for the doorframe. You cannot prove anything. The letter, those were just idle words. I had nothing to do with Lady Henrietta's death." Poirot's gaze never wavered. "Ah, but that is where you are wrong, madame. You see, it is not the words themselves that matter. It is what they conceal. The truth you have worked so hard to bury is rising to the surface." Mrs. March's breathing quickened, and for a moment, Poirot thought he saw her eyes flicker to the open window. Without another word, she turned sharply and began walking toward it, her pace quickening. Poirot's instincts flared, and before she could reach the window, he stepped forward and blocked her path. "Do not attempt to leave, madame," Poirot said, his voice calm but unyielding. "It is over. You cannot escape now." For a moment, there was only silence between them. Mrs. March's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths as she looked at Poirot, her mind clearly racing for an escape. But there was nowhere to run. Poirot had her cornered, and she knew it. "I did not mean for it to go this far," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I only wanted to protect myself. I couldn't let Lady Henrietta expose me, not after everything I've done." She knew too much. She was too close to the truth. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "What truth, madame? What did Lady Henrietta know?" Mrs. March shook her head, her hands trembling at her sides. "She knew about my past, my dealings, the things I've hidden. She threatened to ruin me, to expose everything. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't." Poirot's mind raced as the pieces fell into place. This was not just a case of murder. It was a desperate attempt to silence a threat. Lady Henrietta had known too much about Mrs. March's past, and in her fear, Mrs. March had done the unthinkable. "Did you kill her, madame?" Poirot asked, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Mrs. March met his gaze for a long moment, the weight of her confession hanging in the air. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I did. But I never meant for it to happen like this. I just wanted to protect myself." Poirot stood motionless for a moment, processing the revelation. Mrs. March had thought she could escape, but in her desperation, she had made a fatal mistake. The truth had come out, and it had come too late. Chapter 14. The final piece falls into place. The weight of Mrs. March's confession hung in the air like a dense fog, and for a moment, no one spoke. The room, once filled with the quiet murmurs of guests, was now completely still. The storm outside had calmed, but the tension inside Palmerton Hall had reached its peak. Poirot stood motionless, his mind working at full speed as he pieced together the fragments of information. Mrs. March had admitted to the murder, but there was still more to the story, more layers to uncover, more motives to understand. Why had Lady Henrietta's death been staged so carefully? And why had Mrs. March taken such drastic measures to protect herself? Mrs. March's hands trembled as she looked at Poirot, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this. I thought I could scare her, intimidate her into backing off. But when I confronted her, she wouldn't listen. She was going to expose me, Poirot. I couldn't let that happen." Poirot's eyes remained steady as he studied her. "You believed you could control the situation, madame, but sometimes when one tries to control the truth, it slips through their fingers." Mrs. March's face twisted in guilt, and for the first time, her composure completely crumbled. She sank into the chair by the desk, her head in her hands. "I thought it would be easy. I thought I could cover it up, pretend it was a robbery gone wrong, but everything unraveled. The letter, the necklace, the fan, it all pointed back to me." Poirot approached her slowly, his voice calm but insistent. "It is never easy, madame. The truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how deeply it is buried." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of despair and fear. "But I didn't kill her to protect myself, not entirely. It wasn't just about me. It was about what Lady Henrietta knew, the things she could have said about me, about my past. She had too much power over me, Poirot." Poirot's mind raced, but he said nothing, allowing Mrs. March to continue. The details she was revealing only confirmed what he had suspected. Thus, this was not a simple case of murder. It was a calculated move, a desperate act to preserve a carefully crafted life. "The letter," Mrs. March continued, her voice cracking, "wasn't just about Lady Henrietta threatening me. It was something else, something more. She had discovered something that could ruin everything. She was going to expose my connection to Henrietta Devereux. I couldn't let that happen. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Henrietta Devereux. The name you mentioned earlier. Mrs. March nodded, her eyes distant. Yes, I thought I had buried my past, but Lady Henrietta found it. She knew about my connection to Henrietta Devereux, about the scandalous affairs, the deceitful deals. She was going to expose me, to ruin my reputation, and I couldn't let that happen. I'd worked too hard to build this life. Poirot took a slow step forward. So, you killed her to silence her? Mrs. March nodded, her face pale. Yes, but it wasn't just about silencing her. It was about protecting myself. I couldn't let anyone know the truth. I thought I could get away with it, but I never expected you to come in, Poirot. You're too clever, too perceptive. Poirot stood silently for a moment, his mind calculating the next steps. Mrs. March's confession had opened the door to the truth, but there were still unanswered questions. The murder had been meticulously planned, the clues carefully staged, but why had she involved the others? What role did the rest of the guests play in this tragic tale? You thought you could escape, Poirot said softly. But the truth always catches up with those who try to hide it. Mrs. March's gaze met his, and for a fleeting moment, there was a glimmer of recognition in her eyes. She knew she had been caught, trapped in the web of her own making, but she was also exhausted, drained by the pressure of her lies. I'll never be free of it, will I? She whispered. The lies, the fear, the guilt, it'll never go away. Poirot's gaze softened, but only for a moment. No, madame. The truth is a heavy burden to bear, but it is better than living with the weight of lies. He turned, leaving Mrs. March in the study as he returned to the drawing room. The guests were still gathered, awaiting their fate. The final pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place, and now the truth would be revealed. As Poirot entered the drawing room, he could see the tension in the air. Every eye was on him, each guest waiting for the inevitable. Poirot took a moment to assess the room, his mind sorting through the tangled web of motives, secrets, and lies. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot began, his voice calm but commanding. The truth is now clear. Lady Henrietta Poirot's death was no accident. It was the result of a carefully planned scheme, driven by fear, deceit, and a desire to protect oneself at all costs. The murderer, Madame March, took drastic measures to silence her, but in the end, the truth cannot be hidden. He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. It was you, Madame March, who killed Lady Henrietta. And now, justice will be served. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. Poirot stood at the center of the room, his eyes scanning each guest carefully. The storm outside had calmed, but inside, the tension was palpable. The guests were silent, their faces etched with worry, each of them caught in the web Poirot had carefully spun. The truth was within reach now, and he knew it was time to confront them all, to bring the mystery to its conclusion. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot began, his voice calm but commanding, I believe the time has come for all of us to face the truth. Lady Anstruther, who had been sitting stiffly on the edge of her seat, now straightened her back, her expression one of barely contained anxiety. Monsieur Poirot, you've gathered us here, but surely you don't mean to accuse all of us of complicity in this crime. Poirot glanced at her, his eyes piercing. Madame, you are all involved, whether you like it or not. Some of you, knowingly, others, unwittingly. But the truth is the same for all. Sir Edward Gresham shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. You've been accusing everyone in this room of hiding something, but you haven't proven anything, Poirot. We're all innocent. Poirot's gaze did not leave him. Innocence is not about what we say, Sir Edward, but about what we do. You, like the others, have something to hide. And that, I'm afraid, is the root of this tragedy." He turned to Mrs. Violet March, who had remained stoically silent throughout the confrontation. "Mademoiselle March," Poirot continued, "you are the one who had the most to gain from Lady Henrietta's death. The letter you burned, the necklace you took, it all points to you." Mrs. March's face paled, but she remained seated. Her eyes narrowed. "I've already told you, Poirot. I didn't kill her. I didn't want this to happen." Poirot stepped closer to her, his voice firm. "No, madame. You wanted something else. Something you thought you could control, but you underestimated the power of the truth." He turned to Miss Felicity Gresham, who had been standing by the window, her hands clasped tightly together. "Mademoiselle Gresham, you found the letter, didn't you? The one that had been burned, the one with the name Henrietta Devereux. What do you know about it?" Felicity flinched, her gaze dropping to the floor. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't think it was important." Poirot's eyes softened slightly. "Ah, but it was. It is always the smallest detail, the most seemingly insignificant thing that leads us to the truth. The letter was not a mere piece of paper. It was a key." He took a step back, his gaze sweeping over the room. "The truth is simple, once you see it. Lady Henrietta Poirot was murdered, but the murderer did not act alone. The lies, the secrets, the hidden connections, all of them brought us here. Mrs. March, you killed Lady Henrietta to protect yourself, yes, but also to protect your past." Poirot paused, allowing the words to sink in. "But it was not just the murder itself that mattered. It was the cover-up, the lies you told to obscure the truth, and in the end, that is what brought you down. The truth always comes to light, madame." The room was silent as Poirot's words lingered in the air. He turned to face the others, his voice softening. "You all have your roles in this tragedy. Some of you knew more than you let on, and some of you were caught in the web without realizing it. But the truth, as always, is clear." Lady Anstruther rose slowly from her chair, her face pale but resolute. "I don't know how this happened," she said quietly. "But I know now that we've all been complicit in hiding the truth." Poirot nodded. "Yes, madame. But now the truth is here, and it will set us all free." He turned to Mrs. March, his eyes steady. "Madame March, you have confessed, and justice will be served. The truth cannot be hidden any longer." Chapter 16. The reveal. The room was still. The guests, who had been so full of life and laughter only days before, now stood in hushed silence, the weight of Poirot's words pressing down on them like a heavy fog. They all knew the moment had come. There was no more hiding, no more evasion. The truth, which had long been buried, was about to be laid bare. Poirot turned slowly to face the assembled guests, his eyes scanning each one. They were nervous, uncertain, some avoiding his gaze, others locking eyes with him, daring him to continue. He could feel their fear, the realization that everything they had worked to protect was crumbling. Mrs. March, her composure completely shattered, finally spoke. "What happens now, Poirot? What happened to me?" Poirot's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "Madame March, you will face justice, as all must when the truth is uncovered. But know this, you did not act alone. There are many here who played their part, knowingly or unknowingly. You were driven by fear, a fear of losing everything, of having your past revealed to the world. That fear clouded your judgment and led to the death of Lady Henrietta." Lady Anstruther, who had been standing at the back of the room, stepped forward, her expression drawn tight with emotion. "We have all been complicit in some way, but none of us ever intended for anyone to die." Poirot nodded. "It is true. No one sets out with the intent to kill, but sometimes, when we are faced with our darkest fears, we make choices that lead us down a path from which there is no return." He paused, his gaze shifting to Sir Edward, who had been silent throughout the confrontation. Sir Edward's face was pale, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. "Sir Edward," Poirot said, his voice steady, "you too played a part in this tragedy. Your own involvement in the business with Lady Henrietta, your reluctance to speak up, has left you entangled in the web of deception." Sir Edward's eyes flicked nervously, but he remained silent. Poirot turned back to Mrs. March. "But you, madame, took the final step. You thought you could escape, thought you could cover your tracks, but the truth has a way of finding those who try to hide it." Mrs. March, her face drained of color, finally nodded. "I did it. I killed her. I couldn't let her ruin everything. I thought I had no choice." Poirot's expression softened slightly, though his tone remained firm. "There is always a choice, madame, but you believed in a false one that has led to your downfall." The room remained silent for a long moment, the weight of Poirot's words settling over everyone. The truth was out, and now there was nothing left to hide. Justice would be served, and the consequences of their actions would unfold in due time. Poirot glanced around at the guests, his expression unreadable. "The case is solved. The murderer has confessed. Now, it is up to the authorities to do their part. The rest of you, however, must now reckon with your own consciences." He turned and walked toward the door, his steps slow and deliberate. As he reached the threshold, he paused for a moment, turning back to face the guests one last time. "Remember, mes amis," he said, his voice low, "it is not the crime we commit, but the choices that follow it, that define us." And with that, Poirot left the room, his mind already moving on to the next puzzle, leaving the guests behind to face the truth they had spent so long trying to avoid. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The heavy silence that had settled in Palmerton Hall felt like an oppressive weight. The guests, still reeling from Poirot's final revelations, remained motionless, as if waiting for the inevitable conclusion. Mrs. Violet March, the admitted murderer, sat in a chair, her shoulders slumped with defeat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Poirot had departed, leaving the task of justice in the hands of the authorities. The local constables, who had been summoned after Poirot's careful exposition of the facts, arrived soon after the detective left the scene. The guests now awaited their turn to be questioned formally, each lost in their thoughts, wondering what consequences would follow. The entire household felt the ripple effects of the confession. Poirot's work was done, and with the confession of Mrs. March, the truth had been uncovered. But now came the aftermath, the part where every action had a price, and each of them would have to face the reality of their role in the tragedy. Lady Anstruther, who had been watching the proceedings with an air of quiet resignation, stood up and walked over to Mrs. March. The contrast between them was striking. Lady Anstruther, still bearing the airs of a dignified matriarch, stood with grace. Mrs. March, on the other hand, was a woman broken by the weight of her own choices. "I didn't mean any of this," Mrs. March whispered, her voice hollow, as though life had been drained from her. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt, but I was desperate. I wanted to keep everything I had, to hide the truth, but now—" She trailed off, her voice cracking as the full weight of her guilt consumed her. Lady Anstruther, who had seen so much in her life, was not moved to sympathy. She folded her arms and studied Mrs. March with a mixture of disdain and pity. "You should have thought of that before," she said coldly, "before you murdered a woman for your own selfish reasons." The harshness of her words stung, but Mrs. March didn't respond. She simply sat there, staring at the floor, her face pale and broken. The events that had led them here seemed too surreal to grasp. The scandal, the lies, the careful steps taken to hide the truth, all of it had culminated in this tragic end. The constables took Mrs. March away to begin the formal process of arrest and questioning. She walked away without protest, her shoulders slumped and her head bowed in shame. Poirot had been right. Justice would be served. but the sense of justice did little to ease the burden of the tragedy that had unfolded. As Mrs. March disappeared down the hallway with the constables, Sir Edward Gresham approached Lady Anstruther, his face unreadable. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lady Anstruther nodded, her eyes distant. "It is, I suppose. The murderer is caught. The truth is known. And what of us?" Sir Edward pressed. "What happens now?" Lady Anstruther turned to him, her face hardening with an almost imperceptible shift in her demeanour. "We go on. We put this behind us, as we always do. The world will move on." But Sir Edward, his mind still reeling, wasn't so sure. "And the truth? What happens to the truth?" Lady Anstruther's lips curled into a faint, bitter smile. "The truth is a heavy burden, Edward. Some truths are better left buried." With that, she turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing down the hall, as if nothing had changed. But for Sir Edward, the weight of the truth hung over him, and he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 18. The closing remark. The morning after the storm had passed, the house was quieter than it had been in days. The guests who had once filled the halls with anxious whispers were now scattered, each retreating into their own thoughts. The investigation was over, the confession made, and the murderer taken away. Yet the aftermath still lingered, like the echo of a thunderclap that refused to fade. Poirot sat in the study, a quiet observer as the last remnants of the case unraveled. He was alone, save for the quiet hum of the house, still recovering from the tension of the past few days. The guests had been dismissed, their fates sealed by the truth that Poirot had uncovered. The answers had been found, but the price of those answers was not one that could be easily paid. Lady Anstruther, her dignity intact, but her mind weighed down by the events, had retired to her chambers. Sir Edward Gresham had left the house, his face clouded with guilt and confusion. Mrs. March, the one who had set it all in motion, was now in custody, her future uncertain. Each of them had been touched by the events of the past days, and none would ever be the same. Poirot took a slow sip of his tea, his thoughts drifting over the case. There was something deeply unsettling about it all, something that could not be shaken. The murder was solved, the perpetrator identified, but there was a sadness to it, a darkness that lingered. What drove a person to murder, to go to such lengths to hide their secrets? And what did it say about human nature when the truth was finally revealed? He placed his cup down and stood, his eyes scanning the room one last time. The pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place, but the final picture was not one of triumph. It was one of loss, of lives broken by choices made in the darkness. The door creaked open, and Inspector Garrow entered, his expression solemn. He had been the one to take Mrs. March into custody, and his role in the aftermath of the investigation had been as crucial as Poirot's. He had done his duty, but even he seemed burdened by the weight of it all. "Well, Monsieur Poirot," Garrow said, his voice heavy, "it's done. She's been arrested, and the evidence is in order. The case is officially closed." Poirot nodded but said nothing for a moment, his gaze fixed on the window, watching the light filtering in through the blinds. The world outside had returned to normal, as it always did, but for those involved in the case, nothing would ever be the same. Garrow stood silently, waiting for Poirot's response. Finally, Poirot turned to him, his expression as composed as ever. "The case is closed, Inspector, yes. But the truth is, it is not always as simple as we would like it to be." Garrow raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Poirot smiled, though there was little warmth in it. "The truth is a powerful thing, but it can also be a terrible burden. The lives of those involved will never be the same. And even though justice has been served, there is a cost to it." Garrow nodded, though he seemed uncertain. "You're right, of course. But at least now we know what happened. At least we've got closure." Poirot's gaze turned back to the window, his mind lost in thought. "Closure," he murmured. "Perhaps. But the truth is not something we can ever escape. It follows us, in the shadows, in the choices we make, and in the lives we touch." With that, Poirot turned to Garrow, his expression softening just slightly. "I have no doubt that you will do your part, Inspector. The rest is in your hands." Garrow nodded and left, his footsteps echoing through the quiet hall. Poirot stood alone in the study for a moment longer, lost in the weight of his thoughts. The case was over, but the echoes of it would linger in his mind for some time. As he left the room, he took one last look at the house, at the lives that had been touched, and at the mystery that had been solved. He knew that in the end, it was not the mystery that mattered most. It was the people left in its wake. And with that thought, Poirot stepped into the morning light, the weight of the case finally lifting from his shoulders.